The weekend began with silence. Emily stood by the window, watching gray clouds roll over the small town of Maplewood. The air smelled like rain, and the wind whispered through the tall oak trees that surrounded her backyard. Her husband Mark had left early that morning for a 3-day business trip, leaving her alone in their cozy 2-story house. Normally, she enjoyed her solitude. But this time it felt different, emptier somehow. She wrapped her sweater tighter around her shoulders and looked at the yard. One of the branches of the old oak had already started to bend, heavy from the wind. "I'll handle it later," she muttered to herself, unaware that those words would come back to haunt her. The storm hit harder than she expected. By late afternoon, the wind roared through the streets and rain hammered against the windows. Emily made herself tea and curled up on the couch, trying to distract herself with a book. But when a loud crash shook the house, she jumped up and ran to the back door. The giant oak tree had split in half, blocking part of the yard and crushing her garden fence. For a moment, she stood frozen, staring at the mess. Mark would have known what to do. He was calm under pressure, always practical. But Emily couldn't stand the thought of waiting days for him to come home and see the chaos. She grabbed her raincoat, gloves, and old sneakers, determined to at least move some of the smaller branches. The rain was cold and relentless. She dragged and pulled, slipping on wet grass as thunder rolled in the distance. It wasn't easy, the branches were heavy, and her legs trembled with effort. Every muscle in her body protested, but she refused to stop. She wanted to prove to herself that she could handle things too. By the time she finished, her arms ached, her knees throbbed, and her clothes were soaked through. She limped back inside, exhausted but proud. That night, sound of rain against the window lulled her to sleep. But when she woke up the next morning, pain shot through her legs. Her knees were stiff, swollen, and sore. She could barely walk to the kitchen. "Great," she groaned. "Now I'm stuck." She tried to laugh it off, but deep down she felt small and alone. She called Mark to check in. His voice came through the phone, calm and warm. "Hey, sweetheart. How's everything?" "Fine," she said automatically, not wanting to worry him. "Just some storm damage, but I'm managing." "Are you sure? You sound tired." "Okay, really? Just missing you." He chuckled softly. "I'll be back before you know it." After they hung up, the quiet crept back in. Emily looked around at the empty living room. Every detail reminded her of him, the mug on the counter, his jacket hanging near the door, the small things that felt like company when he was gone. But lately, she'd started noticing how much distance had grown between them. They loved each other deeply, yet their conversations had become shorter, their laughter rarer. That afternoon, while she was trying to water the indoor plants, she spotted someone across the street. A man in a gray hoodie was picking up fallen branches near his driveway. When he looked up and waved, she recognized him as Ethan, the new neighbor who had moved in a few weeks ago. He seemed friendly, always greeting people with a smile. He called out, "Rough storm, huh? Your tree got hit bad," she said with a tired laugh. "I tried to clean it up myself yesterday. Now my knees hate me." Ethan walked closer, staying on the sidewalk. "You shouldn't have done that alone. Next time, call me. I've got tools and a stronger back." His tone was kind, casual, and it made Emily smile. It had been a while since someone spoke to her with that kind of easy concern. "I'll remember that," she said later. As she sat inside with an ice pack on her knees, she kept thinking about Ethan's words. He wasn't flirting or crossing any line. He had just been kind. Still, it reminded her of something she hadn't felt in a long time, being noticed. That evening, as the sky turned orange and the storm clouds cleared, she looked out at the yard again. It was still messy, but the worst was over. She told herself that once Mark came back, they'd fix everything together, the fence, the tree, and maybe even the quiet space that had grown between them. The next morning, she tried to distract herself by cooking. Mark always loved her blueberry pancakes, so she made a batch and froze them for when he returned. Every little thing she did became a way to feel close to him. But the soreness in her knees reminded her of the work she had done in, how alone she'd been while doing it by the third day. Her knees still hurt, but the pain was duller now. She managed to tidy the house, light a candle, and get everything ready for Mark's return. The house smelled like vanilla and coffee, warm and welcoming. She wanted everything to look perfect when he walked in. As she sat on the couch, she heard the sound of the garage door opening. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed him until that moment. She stood up carefully, trying not to wince, and waited by the door. When Mark walked in, tired from travel but smiling, it felt like the house exhaled with relief. "Hey, you," he said, setting down his bag. "You look like you've been busy." Emily smiled faintly. "You could say that. My knees hurt for 3 days straight." His brow furrowed. "What happened?" She hesitated for a second. "This storm. The tree fell, and I tried to clean it up." "You did that alone?" he asked, clearly concerned. "Why didn't you wait for me?" She shrugged, trying to sound casual. "I didn't want to leave it a mess." Mark shook his head but smiled softly, his tone half scolding, half admiring. "You're something else. You know that? Come here." He pulled her into a gentle hug. The warmth of his arms, the familiar smell of his colonnet, all reminded her why she loved him. But as she leaned against him, she also felt something else: uncertainty. Would he notice the distance between them now? Would he understand what these quiet days had shown her about their marriage? She didn't know. But deep down, Emily sensed that this homecoming would be different, because when Mark came back, he wasn't just walking into a house with fallen branches and bruised knees. He was walking into a moment that would quietly change their marriage forever. And as Emily stood in his arms, smiling through the ache, she had no idea that what he was about to see unfold would be something he never expected. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the curtains, lighting up the living room where Mark and Emily sat with coffee. Mark was telling her about his business trip, but Emily barely heard half of it. She was happy he was home, but there was a quiet unease she couldn't shake. The past few days alone had made her realize how distant they'd become, not because of anger or resentment, but because life had slowly filled their marriage with routines instead of warmth. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, noticing her distracted expression. "Yeah," she said quickly. "Just tired." He reached across the table, touching her hand gently. "You really shouldn't have done all that yard work alone. Promise me next time you'll wait." She smiled faintly. "Promise." After breakfast, Mark went outside to check the damage himself. She watched from the window as he examined the fallen branches, nodding as if mentally making a plan. For a brief moment, Emily felt a quiet admiration for him, how dependable he always was. But that admiration came with guilt. She couldn't ignore that part of her had changed in those few days he was gone. She didn't know exactly how or why, only that the quiet had made her notice how lonely she'd been feeling by late afternoon. Emily was icing her knees again when the doorbell rang. She opened the door and found Ethan, the neighbor from across the street, holding a small toolbox and wearing his easy smile. "Hey," he said. "I was driving by and saw the tree damage. Thought I'd help if you still needed it." Emily hesitated. "Oh, you don't have to. My husband just got back. He's outside, actually." Before she could say more, Mark appeared from behind the house. "Hey, you must be the new neighbor," he said, shaking Ethan's hand. "Appreciate you stopping by." Ethan nodded. "No problem. It's a big tree, definitely easier with 2 people." Mark looked back at Emily. "See? You could have waited for help." She rolled her eyes playfully, hiding her embarrassment. I know. Over the next hour, Ethan and Mark worked together, clearing the last bits of debris. Emily brought them lemonade and watched quietly. The 2 men laughed easily, getting along better than she expected. She noticed how natural Ethan was, kind, calm, and friendly. There was something simple about him that made people feel at ease. As the sun began to set, the yard looked clean again. Ethan wiped his hands and smiled. "That should do it." "Thanks, man," Mark said, handing him a bottle of water. "I owe you one." Ethan shrugged. "Just being a good neighbor. You both take care." When he left, Emily stood in the doorway, watching him walk back across the street. She didn't know why she kept thinking about him. It wasn't romantic. Not exactly. It was more about the way he made her feel seen, like he noticed her effort without her needing to explain it. That night, as Mark sat on the couch watching TV, Emily joined him but found her mind wandering. He reached out and pulled her close, his arm around her shoulder. "Feels good to be home," he murmured. "Yeah," she said softly, resting her head against him. But even in his arms, she couldn't shake the thought of how distant their connection had become. The love was still there, it always had been. But something about the way they had both stopped noticing each other hurt her quietly inside. The next day, while Mark was on a work call, Emily stepped outside to water the plants. Her knees were still sore, and she moved slowly. Ethan was out front washing his car, and when he saw her, he waved. "How's the recovery going?" he called out. She smiled. "Better. Still a little sore, though. Next time something like that happens, call me before you try to play superhero." He teased lightly. She laughed. Deal? They talked for a few minutes about the storm, the neighborhood, and how long he'd lived in Maplewood. It was harmless conversation, but Emily couldn't ignore how easy it felt. When Mark eventually came out to get the mail, he saw them talking and gave a small smile. But later that night he asked, "So, you've been chatting with the neighbor a lot?" Emily frowned slightly. "Not a lot, just being friendly. He helped with the yard, remember?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, I know. He seems like a nice guy." There was no accusation in his tone, just a hint of curiosity. Emily reassured him with a smile. "Is nothing more than that." But deep down, she knew something subtle had shifted, not in her feelings for Ethan, but in how she saw her marriage. Talking to someone new made her realize how much she missed real conversation, the kind where you actually listen and respond, not just exchange polite words at dinner. That weekend, Emily tried to bring some spark back into their home. She cooked Mark's favorite meal, put on music they used to dance to, and even laughed when he made a joke halfway through dinner. For a moment, it felt like old times, comfortable, warm, easy. But when they went to bed, she stared at the ceiling for a long time, thinking about the years behind them. She wasn't unhappy, she just wasn't sure she was truly seen anymore. The next morning, Mark had to drive to the city for a meeting. As he left, he kissed her forehead. "Don't do any more heavy lifting while I'm gone," he teased. "I'll try not to," she said with a small laugh. After he left, Emily sat on the porch with her coffee. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the sound of birds. Ethan was mowing his lawn, and when he noticed her, he waved again. She smiled back, realizing how natural it had become to exchange those little gestures. But later that day, while she was rearranging some potted plants on the porch, she twisted her knee again. Pain shot through her leg, and she had to sit down quickly. Ethan saw her and rushed over. "You okay?" "Yeah, I just moved the wrong way," she said, wincing. He crouched beside her, concerned. "You really shouldn't be out here doing all this. Let me help you." She hesitated, but his tone was gentle. He moved the heavy pots while she directed him. It wasn't awkward, it felt like teamwork. When he finished, she thanked him sincerely. "Anytime," he said with a warm smile. "Just take it easy, okay?" As he walked back home, Emily sat there, looking out at the street. Something in her heart felt confused, grateful, but uncertain. She didn't want anything to be misread, yet she couldn't deny that those small acts of kindness had filled a quiet space that had been empty for too long. When Mark came home that evening, he noticed her sitting quietly on the porch. "How's the knee?" he asked. "Still sore," she admitted. He rubbed her shoulder gently. "You've been through enough this week. I'm proud of you for handling everything." Emily smiled at him, her heart softening again. Maybe that was all she needed to feel seen, to feel valued. As the night fell, the air between them grew warmer again. They ate together, laughed a little more, and when Mark reached for her hand, she squeezed it back tightly, still as she went to bed. One thought lingered in her mind, the moments of attention she had missed, the quiet gestures that made her feel alive. And even though she loved her husband deeply, she couldn't ignore that something inside her had changed after those 3 days. And it wasn't just her aching knees. The following week felt calmer, The weather cleared, and the town settled back into its usual quiet rhythm. Emily's knees were healing, and she had finally started to walk comfortably again. Mark was busier than ever, spending long hours on calls and planning his company's next project. Emily tried not to feel left behind. But there were moments when the silence of the house pressed heavily on her. One afternoon, while she was baking cookies for the first time in months, she saw Ethan outside fixing his mailbox. He waved when he noticed her at the window, and she waved back before realizing how automatic that had become. There was something easy about their small exchanges, a sense of understanding that didn't need many words. Later that day, she stepped out with a plate of cookies wrapped neatly in foil. "These are for helping with the yard," she said as she handed them over. Ethan smiled, surprised. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," she replied. "You really helped me out that day." He took one cookie and laughed softly. "Then I'm glad I stopped by. These are amazing, by the way." They stood talking for a few minutes, just about simple things: neighbors, weather, and work. Ethan told her he was an architect working remotely, and that most days he spent hours sketching alone. "It's nice to actually talk to someone," he admitted with a small chuckle. Emily nodded, understanding more than she expected. "I know the feeling." The next few days passed quietly, but their paths kept crossing at the mailbox, at the grocery store, even during morning walks. Each time their conversations grew a little more natural. There was no flirtation, just an unexpected comfort in having someone to talk to who really listened. But Emily knew the fine line she was walking. She loved Mark. He was loyal, hardworking, and kind. Yet part of her couldn't ignore the fact that she and her husband had drifted into routine. Partnership built on years together, but lacking the warmth it once had. One evening, while Mark was on another video call, she sat on the porch again. The sky was painted orange and pink, and Ethan was watering his plants. He waved as always, then called out, "You look better." No more limping. "Almost good as new," she said with a smile. He walked over, standing a few steps away. "You should be proud. Most people would have given up on all that cleanup." She laughed softly. "I didn't have much choice." For a few moments, they stood in easy silence, the sound of birds filling the air. Then Ethan spoke quietly. "You ever feel like life just slowed down, but not in a good way?" Emily looked at him, caught off guard by how close his words were to her own thoughts. "Every day," she admitted. "Sometimes I miss how alive everything used to feel." He nodded, glancing at the horizon. "Yeah, I get that." Before either could say more, Mark opened the front door, holding his phone. "Em, can you help me with something?" She turned quickly. "Coming." When she looked back, Ethan gave her a polite nod and stepped away. The rest of the evening passed quietly, but something inside Emily had shifted again. She didn't know what exactly, only that being understood, even briefly, had reminded her of something she hadn't felt in years. That weekend, Mark announced they were invited to a company dinner. "It's at the new hotel downtown," he said. "They're giving out awards. I want you to come with me." Emily hesitated, surprised. "Are you sure? It's been a while since I went to one of those." He smiled. "I want you there." She spent the next day getting ready, choosing a soft blue dress, fixing her hair, even putting on perfume she hadn't used in months. When she came downstairs, Mark's expression softened. "You look beautiful." For the first time in a long while, Emily felt seen. At the dinner, she watched him from across the table, laughing and talking with his colleagues. He looked proud and confident, the same man she'd fallen in love with years ago. And for a while, she forgot all her doubts. On the way home, they drove in comfortable silence. The city lights blurred through the windshield. Mark reached over and took her hand. "I know I've been distant lately," he said quietly. "Work's been a lot, but I don't want us to lose what we have." Emily turned to him, her heart softening. "We haven't lost it," she said. "Maybe we just need to remember it." He smiled, squeezing her hand gently. The next morning she woke early and decided to make breakfast. The house smelled of coffee and toast when Mark came down looking more relaxed than usual. They talked and laughed over breakfast, and for the first time in months, it felt like their connection was returning, But life has a way of testing peace. That afternoon, Mark got a call an emergency meeting. He packed his laptop bag and left in a rush, promising to be home by dinner. Emily spent the rest of the day cleaning, gardening, and trying to distract herself from the strange ache of emptiness that returned the moment he was gone. Around sunset, a storm rolled in. The wind picked up, rattling the windows. Emily hurried outside to secure the porch chairs when she heard Ethan's voice. "Need a hand again?" He called from across the street. She laughed softly through the noise. "Seems like every storm brings you here." "Maybe it's just good timing," he said with a smile, helping her move the furniture under the awning as the rain poured. They stood under the porch roof, waiting for it to ease. Lightning flashed in the distance, and for a moment, they both watched silently. The air between them felt charged, not romantic, but deeply human. Filled with the weight of unspoken things, Ethan finally spoke. "You and your husband seem really solid." "You're lucky." Emily glanced at him, her voice quiet. "We've had good years. And quiet ones." He nodded slowly. "That's marriage, I guess. Still, it's rare to see people try as hard as you do." His words stayed with her long after he left. That night, Mark came home late and exhausted, apologizing for missing dinner. Emily smiled, understanding more than she let on. She told him it was okay and brought him a plate of food. As he ate, she felt something inside her shift, not because of Ethan, not because of loneliness, but because she realized how easily people can forget to show up for each other until someone reminds them what that looks like. The storm outside faded into quiet. Mark finished his meal, leaned back, and smiled at her. "You know," he said softly, "I've missed talking like this." "Me too," she replied. Later, when they went to bed, Emily lay awake for a while, thinking about the strange chain of events that had unfolded: the storms, the neighbor, the quiet realizations. She didn't feel guilt, only gratitude. Sometimes life sends people into your path not to stay, but to remind you of what you already have. As she drifted to sleep beside her husband, she whispered to herself, "Maybe the hardest part of love is learning how to keep choosing it." And somewhere outside, the rain began again, soft, steady, like the rhythm of something quietly healing. Weeks passed peacefully after the storm. The air felt lighter, the days brighter. Emily and Mark had fallen into a better rhythm. They started having breakfast together again, sometimes even dinner when work allowed. They laughed more, argued less, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a quiet waiting room. It felt like home again. Mark had taken her suggestion to slow down seriously. He now worked from home twice a week, and every Friday night they watched a movie together. Sometimes they didn't even finish it, just talked until midnight about everything they had once left unsaid. Emily could see the effort he was making, and that mattered more than anything. One morning, Emily went for a walk around the neighborhood. The trees were turning golden, and the air smelled like autumn. As she passed by Ethan's house, she saw him loading a few boxes into a truck. He waved when he noticed her. "You moving?" she asked, a little surprised. He smiled. "Yeah, got a project offer in another city. Big opportunity. Couldn't turn it down?" "That's great," she said genuinely. "I'm happy for you." "Thanks," he replied. "You know, this place turned out to be more peaceful than I expected, especially thanks to my neighbor who kept bringing me cookies." She laughed softly. "I only did that once." "Once was enough." There was a pause, the kind that felt like the end of a chapter. "You and your husband seem good," Ethan said quietly. "That's nice to see." Emily nodded. "We're trying again, and it's working." He picked up another box and placed it on the truck. "Good. You deserve that." When he was done, they stood for a moment by the street. The wind rustled the leaves around them. Emily finally said, "Thank you, Ethan, for helping me that day, and for reminding me of things I'd forgotten." He smiled. "Sometimes we just need someone to remind us what we already know." Then he gave a small wave, climbed into the truck, and drove off. She watched until the sound of the engine faded into the distance, feeling both sad and peaceful. Some people come into your life not to stay, but to teach you something, and Ethan had done just that when Emily got home. Oh, she found Mark fixing a loose handle on the kitchen cabinet. He looked up when she entered. "Hey, where'd you go?" "Just a walk," she said, setting her keys on the counter. Ethan moved out. He asked, "That's quick." "Yeah," said he got a job offer. Mark nodded. "Good for him." Then he smiled. "By the way, I'm planning a small trip for us next weekend. Somewhere quiet. No phones, no meetings. Just us." Emily's eyes lit up. "Really? Really?" he said, grinning. "We need it." The following weekend, they drove out to a cabin by a lake. It was simple, just wood walls, a fireplace, and the sound of water outside. Emily stood by the window, watching the ripples shimmer in the afternoon light. Mark came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. "Feels like the world stopped," he whispered. "Maybe it's finally catching up to us," she said, leaning into him. That evening, they cooked together, burning the first batch of pancakes but laughing through it. Later, they sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the moonlight reflect off the lake. Mark took her hand and said, "You know, I used to think love was about big gestures, expensive gifts, long trips, fancy dinners. But lately, I've realized it's just this being here, showing up." Emily smiled softly. "That's all I ever wanted." He nodded. "I know. And I'm sorry it took me this long to understand." They didn't need many words after that. The silence between them felt full, not empty anymore. The next morning, Emily woke early and stepped outside. The air was cool, and a thin mist floated over the lake. She watched the sunrise, golden lights spilling across the water. For the first time in a long time, she felt calm. Not just happy, but truly at peace. When they returned home, life moved on as usual, but everything felt slightly different. There was more laughter in their days, more patience in their words. Mark made an effort to be home for dinner, and Emily found herself painting again, something she hadn't done since college. One afternoon, while she painted by the window, Mark came in holding 2 cups of tea. "You've still got it," he said, looking at her canvas, a peaceful lake under an orange sky. She smiled. "It's not perfect." "Neither are we," he said, handing her the cup. "But it's still beautiful." They shared a quiet moment, sipping tea and watching the light change across the room. Months later, Emily received a postcard in the mail. It was from Ethan. The front showed his city skyline at sunset. On the back, a short message. "Hope the storms have been kind to you. E." She smiled and tucked the postcard into her sketchbook. That single line reminded her of how far she'd come, not just in her marriage, but in understanding herself. That evening, she showed it to Mark. He read it and smiled. "That's nice of him." "Yeah," she said softly. "He was a good neighbor." Mark looked at her with a knowing expression. "Sometimes people show up at the right time," she nodded, "and leave when their part's done." As night fell, they sat together by the fireplace. No TV, no noise, just the sound of the crackling wood. Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, whispering, "Do you ever think about how close we were to losing this?" Mark sighed. "I do. And that's why I'll never take it for granted again." In that simple moment, Emily realized that love wasn't about perfection or excitement. It was about presence. About choosing to stay, to try again, even when life got ordinary. The storms that had once shaken her world had also cleared the air. Leaving behind something stronger, she closed her eyes, listening to the quiet rhythm of the fire, the steady heartbeat of the man beside her. Everything that had once felt uncertain now seemed clear. Sometimes it takes getting lost to remember the way home, and Emily had finally found hers.